At 6:30 in the morning on June 6, 1940-4, 200 yards off the Normandy coast, the steel ramp of a landing craft slowly lowered into the churning sea. 20-3-year-old Comanche, named Larry Sawpitty, crouched behind the ramp, icy sea water soaking through his boots, allied naval fire roaring overhead across the gray morning sky. He was a radio operator with the 4th Signal Company, 4th Infantry Division, and the radio he gripped was about to carve a code no one could break into the history of warfare. The moment the ramp dropped, Sawpitty hit the wits and found a seawall, powered his radio, and spoke to sentences into the microphone that would echo through history. But he did not speak English or French or any European language that morning on the blood-soaked shores of Normandy. Through the static and the roar of naval guns, Sawpitty transmitted to sentences in a language never before heard on any European battlefield in the history of war. SACNUNUI, ATATU, meaning we made a good landing, we landed in the wrong place. Words that carried the weight of history in their unfamiliar syllables. 60 miles inland, in a stone building in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a quiet suburb just west of Paris, a German signals intelligence operator pressed his headphones tighter against his ears. He was one of the men assigned to Kona 5, the Wehrmacht's signal intelligence regiment for Western Europe, and his evaluation center had spent months mapping Allied radio buildup. They had identified unit call signs, tracked divisions by their electronic fingerprints, cataloged frequencies with the precision of watchmakers examining the gears of a clock. They were among the best trained intercept operators in the world, a precision gear in the German military machine that had cracked every code it had ever faced. That morning, as the invasion began, the airwaves exploded with thousands of transmissions pouring across, every band like a flood breaking through a dam. Morse code, encrypted bursts, voice communications blanketed the spectrum, but something was wrong mixed into the American frequencies they had monitored for months. There were signals that conformed to no linguistic system many German analysts had ever studied. Not encrypted, not coded, not scrambled, just sounds that defied identification. The operator wrote down phonetic fragments and passed them up the chain of command, but no one at NAIS-5 could place the language or identify its origin. Not English, not any European tongue, not any language their Japanese allies had briefed them on. It was a dead end before it even began. They did not even know where to begin because what they faced was not a cipher system that could be analyzed, but something entirely beyond the scope of their understanding. But this was only the beginning, for over the next 11 months, German signals intelligence would face an enemy they could never crack, not because it was too complex. It was because it simply did not play by the rules, and this story is about a collision between two civilizations and two fundamentally different ways of thinking about war. One built on order, hierarchy, and standardization, the other built on a belief that ordinary soldiers scattered across the front could make the right decisions without orders from above. To understand why the Germans failed, we must first understand how successful they had been, for German signals intelligence was the most elite electronic warfare force of World War II. During the 1940 campaign in France, they intercepted all communications routed through the French Army's single war ministry station with devastating precision. They precisely mastered French deployments and movements, providing the intelligence that allowed German forces to defeat France in just 6 weeks of lightning warfare. On the Eastern Front from 1940-1 to 1940-2, they intercepted vast quantities of Soviet communications, helping encircle hundreds of thousands of troops. During the Battle of Britain in the Atlantic from 1940 to 1940-1, they even penetrated the Royal Air Force's communication network with remarkable skill. Every opponent was laid bare under the gaze of German signals intelligence, for they did not need to break every code, only find the patterns in the system. Every opponent was like a precision machine, and Germans were masters at understanding machines, dismantling them like watchmakers examining the gears of a clock. Colonel Albert Prawn, the head of German signals intelligence, was a common precise officer who led this vast electronic reconnaissance empire across occupied Europe. His post-war report ran 600 pages, recording German signals intelligence's assessment of every opponent with clinical detachment and professional precision. For the Poles, his tone was clinical coldness. For the French, contempt for a once-minus great opponent. For the British, respect but confidence in their vulnerability. For the Soviets, almost disdain. Their carelessness was a gift from heaven, but for the Americans, the tone changed to something far more unsettling and perplexing. It was the tone of a man describing something he could see clearly but never fully understand, a phenomenon that defied the analytical methods he had perfected over years. Prawn recorded the early ease of intercepting American traffic, then the turning point when that ease vanished like morning, mist before the rising sun of a new technology. He recorded the technical challenges, the FM frequencies his stations could not reach, the volume that overwhelmed his units, the cipher machines his analysts could not crack. But woven through the technical language, there is a recurring observation that Prawn never quite states directly, but circles again and again, like a hunter stalking unseen prey. The Americans did not behave the way an army was supposed to behave, and that observation, repeated throughout 600 pages, contains the answer to everything. Not FM, not slang, not volume, not code talkers. Those were merely symptoms of a deeper cause that was structural and cultural and fundamental to the American way of war. The cause lived in the gap between how the German military understood the world and how the Americans actually operated in it, a chasm no amount of technical skill could bridge. The German military system was built on order, on hierarchical command, standardized procedure, and centralized control, and this was not a weakness but the source of its devastating power. It was precisely what made the Wehrmacht devastating from 1930-9 through 1940-1, and precisely what made German signals intelligence capable of reading every army it faced. Because every army it faced was built on the same principles, the Poles used centralized communication nets. The French routed all traffic through a single station. Even the Soviets, for all their apparent chaos, operated within a rigid hierarchical structure that German analysts could map and predict with confidence. The American system was built on something else entirely, not disorder, that is too simple but distributed authority, the assumption that a sergeant in a foxhole might need to make decisions without a colonel's approval. A 20- to -year sold company commander with a radio could call for artillery, adjust fire, and direct an entire battalion's support in minutes on his own authority, in his own words. This kind of trust was unthinkable in German military culture, where orders flowed only downward and information traveled only along the chain of command. But Americans were different. Their radios were not just communication tools, they were instruments of a command philosophy that pushed decision-making to the lowest possible level. Let us look first at the first wall, the FM revolution. Before World War II, military radio communication used AM technology that traveled along the curvature of the Earth. AM signals reached far distances, but this also meant anyone tuning to the right frequency could intercept them, and Germany's signals intelligence network was built precisely on intercepting these signals. Their listening stations spread across Europe like an invisible spider web, catching every opponent's communications in a net of perfect surveillance. But the Americans completed a technological leap during the war, FM, whose signals traveled in straight lines, communicating within line of sight and vanishing beyond range. This meant American frontline tactical communications simply did not exist for distant German intercept stations. They were invisible, untouchable, gone. The inventor of FM, Edwin Howard Armstrong, was a Columbia University professor who spent decades researching the technology and handed his patents to the military for free when war broke out. This was not a business decision but a patriot's choice. Armstrong believed his technology could protect American soldiers' lives, and he was right. FM technology made American tactical communications invisible to the enemy, unprecedented in military communications history, a revolution born from one man's gift. The FM revolution happened in America and not Britain or Germany, not because American engineers were smarter, but because American military doctrine thought radios belonged at the platoon level. A level where no other army thought radios belonged, and the only technology that could make this work was FM. Technology follows doctrine. Doctrine follows culture. The man who turned FM technology into battlefield reality was Daniel Noble, chief engineer at Galv in manufacturing, the company that would become Motorola. Noble designed a portable FM radio-designated disc, CR300, weighing just 30-5 pounds with a range of about 3 miles, precisely covering an infantry battalion's operational area. Before Noble's design, no army believed a platoon-level unit needed its own radio, let alone that such a radio was technically feasible. But Noble proved it was not only feasible but necessary. In 1940, the U.S. Army ordered the first SC, or 300s, and by war's end, over 50,000 of these radios reached the front, transforming how infantry fought and becoming the nightmare of German signals intelligence. But FM was only the first wall. The second wall was volume, perhaps the most overwhelming of all. Imagine you are a highly trained German intercept operator. Your ears can distinguish subtle differences between radio models. Your notebook records the purpose of every known frequency. Your brain can judge a communications priority in seconds. On the Eastern Front, you process hundreds of communications daily and think this is the limit. Then you transfer to the Western Front facing the Americans. You find yourself confronting not hundreds but thousands or even tens of thousands of signals pouring in simultaneously, a flood that no training prepared you for. American industry produced over 130,000 hand-held radios during the war, shipping them steadily to the front lines where every platoon, every squad, even every fire team had its own radio. German analysts faced not hundreds of communications, but a flood of tens of thousands arriving simultaneously, their intercept stations overwhelmed, their analysts crushed, their systems overloaded. This was not because Americans wasted radio time, it was because the American industrial base could produce 130,000 hand-held radios and ship them to the front. An output that German industry, starved of raw materials and under constant bombardment, could not begin to approach. Production follows capacity, capacity follows the economy. The third wall was slang. When German analysts finally intercepted American communications, they faced an almost unrecognizable form of English. The American military had drafted 12 million men from every corner of the nation, factory workers and farmers, sons of immigrants and college boys. African Americans who spoke the English of Harlem and whites who spoke the English of Appalachia, and put them all on the same frequency. When a soldier from Brooklyn and a soldier from a Texas ranch talked over the radio, German analysts heard not English, but a hybrid dialect they had never studied. Slang, regional expressions, cultural references, sports metaphors, these were practically another language to an analyst raised in strict linguistic training. This was not a training failure, it was the very makeup of the country, a nation so vast and diverse that its own soldiers could barely understand each other. The fourth wall was cipher. The American military's M-09 cipher machine was a portable, mechanical encryption device, less complex than the German Enigma. But its sheer numbers and key-change frequency exhausted German analysts. There were simply too many messages encrypted on too many different keys to break them all in time. German cryptanalyst Reinhold Tweber, in a former cigar factory near Frankfurt, assembled a machine from precision parts specifically to break the M-09. His machine succeeded. It cracked American tactical ciphers, but it was too late. The war moved too fast. Weber's decryption results reached the front only after the lines had already shifted. And even having broken the M-09, the Germans faced only the tip of the iceberg, because America had higher level encryption systems they could never touch. The fifth wall, and the most mysterious, was the code talkers. Returning to that Normandy morning, Larry Sawpitty's Comanche language transmission was just the beginning. The American military had used Native American code talkers in both World Wars. In World War I, Choctaw soldiers transmitted information in their native tongue, leaving German intercept operators completely bewildered. In World War II, the program was massively expanded. 13 Comanche soldiers were assigned to the 4th Signal Company, landing at Utah Beach. They fought through Cherbourg, St. Lo, and the Battle of the Bulge, their Comanche language carrying messages that no German analyst could decipher. 8 Meskwaki soldiers served with the 30-4th Division in North Africa and Italy, 3 of whom endured German and Italian prison camps without ever revealing the existence of the code. The Navajo are better known for their service in the Pacific, but the Comanche and Meskwaki stories are equally heroic, equally vital to the war effort. The code talkers were effective, not just because Comanche or Meskwaki were obscure languages, though they certainly were, but because the United States was the only nation on Earth that contained within its borders hundreds of indigenous languages. The very tools that had been used to marginalize these people, boarding schools, forced assimilation, cultural suppression, had failed to erase their languages. Those surviving languages became weapons no enemy could replicate because no enemy possessed them, a logic Germans could never comprehend. That oppression forged the tools of resistance, and the cultural heritage of the oppressed became the very weapon that protected their oppressor's enemy. 5 walls, 1 foundation. That foundation was a country too large, too decentralized, and too productive for a hierarchical intelligence system to model. The Germans could not decode American chatter because American chatter was not a system. It was a culture, messy, informal, fast, multilingual, vast. Transmitted at the speed of sound across frequencies the Germans could not hear, in dialects they could not parse, in languages they could not break. Prawn never wrote those words, but his report, read carefully, says exactly that in the space between what he documented and what he could not explain. After the war, the radios went silent, and the men who operated them went home. Those who survived returning to lives the war had interrupted, but not erased. Albert Prawn was taken into American custody, spent 5 years as a prisoner, then as a consultant wrote the 6-100-page report documenting everything. He died in 1970-5 in Munich at the age of 80. His report sits in the files of the National Security Agency, a monument to a system that mastered every enemy except one. Reinhold Tweber, the crypt analyst who built the M-09- breaking machine, survived the evacuation from St. Ger, Main-N-Lay. His device worked, but it did not matter. Weber's story did not become public until 2004, by which time the machine he built existed only in memory, a triumph that came too late to change anything. Edwin Howard Armstrong, the Columbia professor who invented FM radio and gave his patents to the military for free, never saw recognition for what his gift meant on the battlefield. After the war, he was consumed by patent litigation against RCA, which had adopted FM for commercial broadcasting without adequate compensation. The legal battle drained all his energy and wealth. On January 30-1st, 1950-2, Armstrong put on his overcoat and hat, opened the window of his 13th- floor apartment on the East River in New York, and stepped out. He was 60-3. The man who gave the American soldier a voice the enemy could not hear died in silence. No bugle at his funeral, no general salute, just an open window and an empty room. Daniel Noble returned to Galv and manufacturing, renamed Motorola after the war. He became the company's executive vice president and helped build it into one of the largest communications firms in the world. His wartime creation, the SCR-300, evolved into police radios, and eventually the cellular technology Motorola would pioneer decades later. Every time you pick up a phone and speak to someone without thinking about who might be listening, you are living in the world Daniel Noble helped build. The code talkers came home to the 13 Comanche soldiers of the 4th Signal Company, who landed at Utah Beach, fought through Cherbourg, St. Lo, and the Ardennes, returned to Oklahoma. Several had been wounded, All carried bronze stars and purple hearts. None had been killed. In July 1940-6, the town of Walters, Oklahoma, held the first Comanche homecoming celebration. There was singing, there was dancing in the old way, the warrior's way that government boarding schools had tried to stamp out. Men who had used their language as a weapon celebrated with language. But the world did not hear their story. Their service was classified for decades. Heroes who should have been recorded in history forced to spend the rest of their lives in silence. Comanche code talkers lived ordinary lives, working, raising families, growing old, unable to tell anyone what they had done during the war. The same was true for the 8 Meskwaki soldiers, 3 of whom endured prison camps without revealing the code's existence. Their 8 families represented a significant share of the entire tribe. They kept the secret as steadfastly as their ancestors had held the land. It was not until 1960 that the military declassified the code talker programs. Even then, recognition was slow. The Navajo code talkers of the Pacific received the Congressional Gold Medal in 2001. The Comanche and Meskwaki code talkers waited longer. In 2013, nearly 70 years after the war, Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to code talkers from 30-3 tribes, including the Comanches and the Meskwaki. By then, every one of the original Comanche code talkers had passed away. Charles Codebreakers, the last of them, died in 2005 at the age of 80-3. A few years before his death, he said something that carries more weight than any paragraph in Prawn's 6-100-page report. "My language helped win the war, and that makes me proud, very proud." His language, the one they tried to take from him, Larry Sawpitty, the young man on Utah Beach, the voice that opened this story, survived the war and came home to Oklahoma. He had been Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr.'s personal radio operator, driver, and orderly. Roosevelt himself died of a heart attack in Normandy 5 weeks after the landing. Sawpitty outlived him by decades, but his war began undended with the same instrument, a radio, a voice, and a language that no German operator on Earth could decode. Why did German radio operators give up decoding American chatter? Because it was not a system. It was a country, noisy, informal, multilingual, and free, talking to itself across an ocean in every voice it had. And those who tried to listen could only take off their headphones and face a world they could never understand, a world built from the voices of freedom, impregnable and enduring. That is the full truth of this story, a truth about sound and silence, about the voices that carried a war and the silence that tried to contain them and failed. If you want more untold stories of how freedom outsmarted tyranny's most sophisticated intelligence machines, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. I am your battlefield decoder, bringing you the signals that changed history, and I will see you on the next frequency.